Thank you for inviting me along to speak to you all this morning. As Jackie introduced me, my background in FSAI is in regulatory affairs, so it covers all of the different pieces of food legislation right across the board. But obviously for today, the subject that I'm going to look at is food labelling. And coming from the regulatory point, I do want to go through, what is the mandatory information, what are on food labels, and try to give a background to some of the key points. But at the same time, rather than turning this into a labelling presentation as such, because as you said, Jackie, labelling is just the piece of legislation that keeps on giving, and it's never clear cut. It's such a huge piece of legislation. There are so many exemptions and derogations, so that really, when we're tasked with having a look at, any information on a food label, there's so many different, parts that we must look at. So I want to try today to tie the regulatory piece alongside, how the information is used by food businesses, by, product developers, so that then they're marketing their food in a certain way. So we'll kick off and have a look, just a quick introduction to the FSAI for those of you who don't know much about us. We are a food law enforcement body. We're an independent body set up under the Food Safety Authority of Ireland Act. But the key thing here, and that ties nicely in with the theme today, is that we are science-based. So our decisions would be science-based, and it would encapsulate so much of the research and the work on all the different various subjects. Obviously, we have we have the role of enforcing the legislation, but in that said, we also have a role in preparing and providing support and guidance to allow for compliance building, so that food businesses are aware of their obligations. And I suppose it's not the easiest read when you take up a piece of food legislation. So by engaging with the various industry groups, whether we have a retail forum, an artisan forum, and food service forum, and many others, it's just a way for us to be able to communicate and to ensure that the rules are met. So if we get into the theme now of food labelling, just a very quick brief on how it's all decided, because again, from time to time we will get, and if it's like we've had the mention of, we'll hear about sugar and sugar consumption later. Consumers will have various different needs or interests in terms of food and the composition of food. So obviously there are certain things they might want to see on labels, or maybe they don't like them presented in certain ways. And so just in terms of the background, the legislation comes from Europe. So the European Commission will propose a piece of legislation that then would have to go to, it will be shared between the European Council and the European Parliament. Each of the member states involved would have representation. So ourselves, along with the Department of Health, would attend these meetings so we can input in terms of any of the particular aspects of each of the pieces of legislation. So it's a very lengthy process. It doesn't happen overnight, but at the end of the day, it's all about the Commission looking after the member states towards having a consistent approach to the food rules. And so for food labelling, just very briefly for anybody interested in getting more information, the particular piece of legislation that looks after the labelling of pre-packed foods is what we refer to as FIC. It's Food Information to Consumers, and that's Regulation 1169 of 2011. I've also flagged here, we have a specific piece of legislation again from Europe, and it covers nutrition and health claims, which we'll see a little bit later in my presentation. And just really then to just let you know that as well as the European legislation, which may be in the form of a regulation or a directive, there's also the opportunity for member states to introduce their own national rules. So we would have done that for each of the two pieces of legislation that I've referred to there. So just then a question to throw out there: who reads food labels? And again, the information I have here on the date on the screen, it's old enough in terms of it's 2009 information. We would have gone out to do a survey back in December 2009 to gather information to bring to the table when the new FIC, food information legislation, was coming about. So that piece of legislation was published in 2011. So as part of our information gathering, we set about to see, well, who reads the labels? What are they looking for on labels? And interestingly enough, when we look at it, yes, we can see there's a good span of the respondents who usually would or always did look at labels, but we found that 27% of the respondents never looked at a food label. Now, I suspect, as I said, it is older piece of information. I suspect if we were to do that now, and if we were to ask the same question now, I think we would see a lot more people who read food labels. There's a whole change in the dynamic of the way people are choosing food. you know, picking foods, if it's to do with maybe higher protein foods. There's a whole different subset of food groups, if you like, that people are following. So I suspect, as I said, that this research, this information, if we were to do it again, would change with more people looking at the labels. And just to tie on with that, then the Food Standards Agency back in 2016, this is the Food Standards Agency Northern Ireland, they also followed up with some research and also had a look at to see, well, why do people not read the labels? And again, things like you're familiar with buying the same things. And again, that is true. As a shopper myself, I know you go in to buy the same things. However, I think there's probably a change again, and even considering our lockdown and our COVID, it became the highlight to go to the supermarket at one stage. So I think people are more aware of the types of foods. They tend to read the labels. And of course, we have a population that have to read food labels for certain allergens and to avoid consumption of certain foods. So again, the research here showed that the attention is driven for certain consumers because of particular information they needed. So as I said, the allergen, or if it was a specific diet. And then outside of that, it really fell back to looking at the use by dates and the best before. But there's so much more information that has to be on a food label. And I've listed the 11 points that fall out of FIC, the Regulation 1169. And again, as I said, if we were to go through each of these points individually, each one of these have other provisions and very specific requirements. So as I said, for today, that's not what my objective is. It's to really just highlight to you that this is the information that needs to be on a food label. It's mandatory information. Yes, there are some of the derogations, but that would be very specific to food products. In terms then of, you know, why should we read labels and what are the key influencers? So for those, for the respondents that had been always looking or pretty much always looking at labels, obviously the use by and best before date, and they're two separate declarations. A use by date is something, it's on products that have a short shelf life that would be likely to cause an illness after a certain period of time. A best before date would be on foods like your dry goods, cereals and biscuits that could go on pretty much, you know, indefinitely. They'll go stale, they're not a safety risk. As I mentioned already, people will look for the allergen information because obviously that's a safety issue. There's also origin declaration. That's a huge topic now, that food consumers are more interested in to know where their food has come from. And then I suppose we can tie the next two together, the nutrition information and nutrition and health claims, because again, the consumer wants to know the nutrition profile of the food they're buying and if there's any benefits to it. So I'm just going to look very briefly at some of these. The allergens, the legislation FIC lists 14 allergens or category of allergens that if any of these are present in the ingredient declaration, you use it in your recipe, they have to be highlighted on your label in a way that distinguishes that ingredient from all others. So whether it seems to be the rule of thumb that industry have chosen to use bolding that particular ingredient, there could be any other way of doing it. But the key thing is that if I as a consumer go to the supermarket, I pick up a food product, on the ingredient declaration, I can clearly see the allergen that I may need to avoid. Okay. The origin labeling is a bit of a tricky one. The rule of thumb with origin on food labels is that you don't have to give an origin unless its absence would mislead the consumer. So what we mean here is that, yes, we have a certain section of foods that under their own product specific legislation, they need to have origin on there. For example, beef has to give you the origin, honey, and there are some other pieces of legislation. But under the general labeling legislation under FIC, if you don't mislead your consumer in any way, so there's no color scheme, no flags, no representation on that label, and your food doesn't fall into the product specific legislation requiring origin, you don't have to give it. However, if we move on and you start to put a color scheme on there, if you start to give any emblems on the label that now lead the consumer on to believe it's an Irish product, when in actual fact it was either imported or none of the ingredients used are Irish, well, in that case, we're into the category of being misleading, and that's something that we would be following up to enforce. And just very briefly to say that there are separate origin rules now that require the origin not only on beef, but on any fresh or frozen meat from pigs, sheep, goats and poultry. So if you go to the supermarket now and you pick up chicken fillets or pork chops, you will see the origin of that meat on its own. When that meat is used in another, whether it's a stir fry or any other type of product that you buy as a chilled product, it's outside the scope of these rules. So you can see how the number of rules start to add on. There's an accumulation of legislation. And again, just to very briefly mention that there are rules since 2018 in place that you have to give the origin of the primary ingredients. So if you go to your supermarket this evening and you pick up a chicken curry, and the label may indicate to you, well, you know, it has a lovely color scheme, it looks Irish, this looks like a good product. You must ensure then, as the business operator, that the chicken that you used in that curry is also Irish. And if it's not, well, then you have to give the origin of the chicken. So remember, all of this comes back to food information to the consumer. You have to provide them with what they need to know. In terms of the nutrition declaration, then here is the legal minimum in terms of what has to be on a food label. Again, it's providing the consumer with the nutritional profile. It has to be in this order of nutrients. And the declaration must also be given per 100 grams or 100 mils. Now, the FIC legislation allows additionally to put voluntary information in terms of portion size, reference intakes, so that you can relate back to how much you should be consuming of each nutrient per day. But this is the legal minimum table. So you will see this table as a definite. You may see some other nutrients included as supplementary nutrients. So you'll see maybe fiber, you'll see vitamins and minerals. And if you see vitamins and minerals labeled in the nutrition declaration, you will definitely have to see the absolute amount, but you'll also see the reference intake, because they can be so tiny in micrograms that you need to be able to relate that to how much you should be consuming of that vitamin and mineral. So that's just a quick kind of step on some of the key points in terms of mandatory labeling. What I want to have a look at now, that all falls under the food information to consumers. It's what has to be given. And so I suppose I just want to bring up some, you know, points on food marketing. So we're looking at food information versus food marketing. If we were to look at the cartons of milk and the carton of juice, if you were to go to the supermarket and see that white carton on the shelf and maybe the shelf talker in front to tell you it's milk or it's orange juice, it's not exactly, you know, grabbing your attention. However, you can see then that the more that, and you'll see this from looking at labels yourselves in the supermarket, the more information, the more color that's put on food labels, it's attracting the consumer eye. But what we have to be mindful, and again, coming back to the regulatory piece from the FSAI side, is that what you put on this information, it's voluntary. You're adding extra information for your consumer outside of what's the mandatory declaration, and so you must fall within the scope of what you're permitted to do. So the likes of things like premium quality, farm fresh, there's so many, I couldn't list them all. You will see so many different words on food labels that sometimes you might say to yourself, well, what does that actually mean? And if the label doesn't provide you with a description to help assist you, you really aren't any better off in terms of, but it looks good. So just take a look at this one here. It's how about natural carrots? They're guaranteed natural. Well, of course they're guaranteed natural, because all carrots are going to be grown. There's nothing you can do to the carrot to allow it still be called a carrot. And again, when you see something like this on a label, to see that it's natural, my first thing to say, well, have I ever seen an unnatural carrot? Or indeed, when I see natural on labels, whether it's a compound, a composite food that has many other ingredients, my key question is, well, did it grow on a tree or was it picked somewhere? And the answer is no. So you have to be very careful that you can't use the word natural in something that has many different ingredients, but you may then, on the other hand, be able to say made with natural ingredients, so that your ingredients that went into whatever the food product is. So these are just little kind of, I suppose, buzz terms to think about. Here are some other ones I mentioned: natural, traditional, farmhouse, artisan. So again, if you're going to use any of these terms, they're not legislated for because they're not defined in FIC. However, we have produced some guidance to try and support the industry to provide, I suppose, specifics and criteria that you can use these terms once your food product can meet the criteria. So you can see that it can't just be a kind of a throwaway, that you know, the challenge between those in the food industry that are in the regulatory team versus those that are marketing, I can imagine they're interesting conversations, but at the end of the day, what you put on the food label has to be legal and it can't mislead the consumer. And like that, I mentioned the whole traditional. You'll see we have two signs here: traditional Irish pizza and traditional Irish stew. I don't think an Irish pizza is anything traditional. And again, in the criteria that goes with being traditional is that you would have to have that tradition being 30 years old as a minimum. So again, these are the kind of things that I suppose those labeling foods as a marketeer maybe don't really think about. But obviously these are the kind of things that from our side we have to pick up on. I'm not going to go through, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I really just want to flag that again under FIC Article 7, it lists out all of the ways that you could mislead the consumer. You can do so through any of the characteristics of the food, and I suppose we've probably looked at some of those now. If you claim, or if you give any property to your food that the food doesn't actually have, or if you emphasize a special characteristic to your food when in actual fact all other similar foods on the market, other brands have exactly the same characteristic, well, again, you can't make that link. So again, I just thought this was quite a nice label here about the free range baby potatoes. We plant them in the fields and they choose not to run away, so they're free range. So again, you can come up with any amount of wording as the food business operator labeling, but again, we have to always bring it back to Article 7 of FIC. So again, just to, as I said, as our role as the FSAI, we're also there to provide guidance and support. And this is just one particular document, a guidance note 29, the use of food marketing terms, which is really helpful, that if any food business was looking to label their foods with any of those terms, traditional, artisan, etc., that they will find the guidance there. Again, I'm due to wrap up. I've only a few more slides here, but again, I just want to emphasize, and I think this is something that's forgotten as well, is that, the trend now is towards online sales. We have seen this through COVID, that businesses had to change their way, to keep going, through social media and online sales. So the same rules apply. So it doesn't matter if you're not having any contact with your customer, the same thing, the information that has to be on the pre-packed food still has to be on the food that you're selling online, but in this case you must make this information available before the consumer makes their purchase. And likewise, if you put any of those terms or any other claims on the food on the website, they have to meet the legislation. It's exactly the same thing, and again, we would enforce anything that goes online the same way as it would if it was on a physical label in the supermarket. So just very briefly then to look at food marketing with regard to nutrition and health claims, again, just to say that the claims, they're not new, okay? They've been regulated since 2006 because of the fact that we're so much various different, I suppose, suggestions and information put on food labels. There are two different types of claims in Regulation 1924. I had that on an earlier slide. There's either a nutrition claim, so that would be something like contains protein or high in vitamin C. Regulation 1924 lists all of the nutrition claims that you are permitted to use, along with the criteria that goes with each one. If it's not on that list, you're not permitted to use it on your label. The other side is then the health claim, and that's going a little bit more because it's linking the food back to the actual, I suppose, health of the consumer. And again, something like for the protein, it will be contains protein, which contributes to the maintenance of muscle mass. So now you're allowing the consumer know that the reason the protein is here is because it's contributing to maintaining your muscle mass. And that's another key point to say when it comes to marketing food, is that the wording has to be kept fairly close to what the Commission has set in the claim. Because if you go to say that it enhances or increases muscle mass, that's a totally different message to the maintaining. And again, for vitamin C, it contributes to normal collagen formation for the normal functioning of bones. So again, the consumer can relate the nutrient to the health benefit. And this, as I said, is very tightly regulated. You'll see on the EU Register of Claims, if you want to put anything on the food label in terms of a health claim, you need to go to check the register here to search for your food or your nutrient. You will find if the claim is authorized or not. If it's authorized, you can use it. And as I said, you must stick with the actual wording that's permitted. Okay, so I suppose all of this is really bringing us back to wondering, well, what can we say? So this was an old Guinness sign. Some of you will remember it, Guinness for strength. So that was, I suppose, an innocuous marketing tool going back over the years. So again, now because we have nutrition and health claims, we can't actually say this anymore because it's not substantiated. Guinness is not going to provide you with strength. So if we have a look at another example, it's a lovely day for a Guinness, and we still have the same image. And again, yes, it possibly is a lovely day for a Guinness, maybe later on. But again, the image that's implying the strength again is a no-no. So again, it's not permitted because it's implying a benefit. So that's another key thing to remember. It's not just your words or your text, it's everything graphically that you put on the food label. But however, this nice one, lovely day for Guinness, there's nothing implied here. So in this particular case, that's fine. So I suppose that just really brings me to the end of what I wanted to cover. I was trying, when I was trying to think out the presentation, I didn't really want to get into the, the nuts and bolts of the labels and what has to be on them and how it looks, but I wanted to be able to just bring it across to see, well, yes, we have the rules. Here are other things that go on food labels and really how it ties together in terms of enforcement.